Right now, somewhere in the world, a song is playing. You've heard it before. I promise you that. Maybe on an old car radio driving through a quiet town at dusk. Maybe in the background of a movie scene, right at the moment when someone is waiting for a letter that might change everything. Maybe your mother hummed it while folding laundry on a Sunday afternoon and you never thought to ask her why she knew every single word. Maybe you heard it at a barbecue last summer and it made you feel something you could not explain, something warm and aching at the same time. The song is called Please, Mr. Postman, and if you have spent any time at all listening to American music, it has already found you. It did not ask permission. It simply arrived, the way all great songs do, and made itself at home inside your memory. It crossed oceans, it crossed decades, it crossed genres. The Beatles covered it and brought it to a new generation. The Carpenters turned it into something soft and golden. Radio stations across the world still reach for it when they want to remind you what longing sounds like, what waiting feels like, what it means to hope that something is coming, even when you are not sure it will. It became one of those rare songs that stopped belonging to a single artist or a single moment and started belonging to everyone. But here's the thing nobody tells you. The man who helped write that song, the man who turned a half-finished idea into the first #1 hit in Motown history, died in 2006. He died quietly. No major headlines, no televised tributes, no ceremony, just silence. The same kind of silence that had followed him for most of his life. His name was Freddie Gorman, and if that name means nothing to you right now, that is exactly the problem. Because it should mean something. It should mean a great deal. This is not a biography. This is not a tribute video set to soft piano music where we list dates and accomplishments and move on. What you are about to hear is something closer to an investigation, a tracing back of steps, a reconstruction of a story that was deliberately left incomplete. Because somewhere between the moment that song was born and the moment the world decided to celebrate it, a name was removed. A voice was pushed to the margins. And a man who poured his actual lived experience into the lyrics of a song that changed American music was left standing on the outside of his own creation. The question I want to answer today, with you right here, is simple, but it carries weight. How does the person who helped build the foundation disappear from the building? And what does it say about us, about this industry, about how we treat the people who give us the music we love, that we let it happen? Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you heard Please, Mr. Postman before? Tell me in the comments. And if you think you already know who wrote it, hold that thought. Because what you are about to learn might change the way you hear that song forever. Settle in. This one is going to stay with you. To understand how a name gets erased, you first have to understand the world that allowed it to happen. So let us go back. Not to the hit, not to the fame. Let us go back to the streets. Detroit, in the late 1950s, was not glamorous. It was a factory city. A city of long shifts and tired hands and front porches where people sat in the evening because the houses were too warm inside. The automobile industry had drawn families from every direction, promising work, promising something close to stability. And for the most part, it delivered. But it delivered in a way that left very little room for softness. You worked. You came home. You ate whatever was on the table. You did it again the next day. And the day after that. The rhythm of survival was steady, reliable, and unforgiving. And yet, inside that machinery, something beautiful was growing. Something the factories could not produce and the time clocks could not measure. On street corners, in church basements, through the open windows of crowded apartment buildings on humid summer nights, music was everywhere. Not polished music. Not the kind that came wrapped in contracts and marketing plans and record label logos. This was raw music, doo-wop harmonies floating beneath yellow streetlights while girls walked past pretending not to listen, gospel choirs that made the walls shake and the floorboards tremble beneath the weight of feeling, jazz musicians playing sets in tiny clubs until 3 in the morning for audiences who came not because they could afford it, but because they needed it. Rhythm and blues pouring out of juke joints and barbershops. Detroit had a sound before anyone gave it a name. And every young person who grew up breathing that city's air carried a piece of it inside them, whether they realized it or not. Now, somewhere in the middle of all this, a man named Berry Gordy had an idea. He had been writing songs, producing tracks, and watching the industry from the outside long enough to know that black artists were creating the most compelling music in America, but receiving almost none of the profit. So he decided to build something new, a record label, a black-owned label that would control the music from creation to distribution. He bought a small house on West Grand Boulevard, hung a sign that read Hitsville, USA, and began pulling in every talented person he could find. That house became Motown, but in those earliest days, it was not an empire. It was an experiment held together by duct tape and determination. The walls were thin, the equipment was borrowed or secondhand. The studio was so small that musicians sometimes had to record in shifts because everyone could not fit at once. The contracts were loose, often handwritten on scraps of paper, sometimes barely explained before they were signed. Writers, singers, and musicians drifted in and out based on who knew who and who showed up on the right afternoon with a melody worth hearing. There were no human resource departments. There were no legal teams reviewing every songwriting credit. There were no formal systems for tracking who contributed what to which song. There was ambition. There was chaos. There was a shared pot of coffee and a belief, almost religious in its intensity, that something extraordinary was about to happen. But here is the detail that matters most for our story. In a system built on relationships and informality, the people who were quietest were the easiest to overlook. The ones who did not demand contracts, the ones who contributed ideas without insisting their names be attached, the ones who showed up, did the work, and trusted that the work itself would be enough. Now ask yourself this: in a place like that, who is most likely to be remembered? The person who fights for every credit? Or the person who simply loves the music and trusts the people around him? Hold that question. Because the answer just walked through the door. A mail carrier from Detroit with melodies in his head and no idea that the world was about to take everything he offered and forget to say his name. Freddy Gorman was born on the 11th of April, 1939, in Detroit. He did not come from money. He did not come from a musical family with connections. He came from the same working-class neighborhoods that fed the factories and filled the churches and gave the city its heartbeat. And from the moment he was old enough to understand what he was hearing, he knew that sound was the language he understood best. As a boy, Freddie absorbed everything around him like water soaking into dry earth. The gospel that poured out of Sunday services and followed people home. The doo-wop groups rehearsing on corners after dark, 5 or 6 young men leaning into each other's voices like they were building something sacred. The jazz that drifted from clubs he was too young to enter but old enough to stand outside and listen to through the walls. He did not talk about becoming a star. He did not perform for the attention of adults or dream out loud about seeing his name on a marquee. He simply listened, deeply, completely. And inside that listening, something took root that would define the rest of his life. A bass voice, rich, warm, steady. Say, like the foundation of a house, the kind of voice that does not try to stand out but somehow holds everything together. People noticed it before he did. Teachers, friends, the older men on the block who had been singing long enough to recognize a gift when they heard one. By the time he was a teenager, Freddie was already part of the street corner harmony scene that defined young black musical life in Detroit. He joined a group called the Qualitones, and in 1955, still in high school, they recorded a song called Tears of Love for Josie Records. It was not a hit. It barely made a ripple, but for Freddie, hearing his own voice played back through a speaker for the first time was a confirmation of something he had quietly believed his entire life. He belonged in music. That record was not a breakthrough, it was a doorway. After the Qualitones dissolved, Freddie joined another group with 2 friends, Sonny Sanders and Brian Holland. They called themselves the Fiddletones. They rehearsed constantly. They recorded a track called Pretty Girl for Aladdin Records in 1959. Again, no commercial success. The group eventually fell apart the way most young groups do, not with drama, but with the slow pull of real life. Bills needed paying, futures needed planning. Dreams, no matter how bright, could not cover rent. So Freddie did what millions of working people do. He found a job. He became a mail carrier. Every morning, he walked long routes through the neighborhoods of Detroit, carrying letters from house to house, porch to porch, street to street. And here is where the story turns. Because most people would see that job as the end of the dream. Freddie saw it as something else entirely. While he walked, he hummed, while he delivered envelopes that held other people's hopes, fears, love letters, final notices, and promises that might or might not be kept. He shaped melodies in his mind. The rhythm of his footsteps on concrete became the rhythm of his songs. The creak of a mailbox opening, the sound of a screen door swinging shut behind him, the way a woman's face changed when she saw an envelope with handwriting she recognized, the way a man's shoulders dropped when the box was empty again. All of it was entering Freddie's creative bloodstream, the world he moved through every day, the anticipation of a letter, the disappointment when nothing arrived, the quiet power of being the one who carries something meant for someone else. All of it was becoming music inside him. He just did not know yet what song it was building toward. Then came Brian Holland. Freddie's old bandmate from the Final Tones had joined Berry Gordy's young team at Motown. And through Brian, Freddie found himself pulled into the creative atmosphere of that small house on West Grand Boulevard. He was not hired. He was not on salary. He was not given a title. But he was there, offering lyric ideas, helping shape melodies, contributing in the informal, unstructured way that defined Motown's earliest creative process. And then one day, a woman named Georgia Dobbins from the Marvelettes brought in an unfinished idea, a concept, a title, the beginning of a melody. The song needed a story. It needed someone who understood the world it was describing. Brian Holland knew exactly who to call. He called Freddie, the mail carrier. And Freddie did not have to imagine anything. He didn't sit in a room staring at a blank page trying to conjure what it feels like to wait for a letter. He had spent years walking those routes, thousands of miles through Detroit neighborhoods. He knew the weight of an envelope in his hand. He knew the sound a screen door makes when someone rushes out hoping for news that might save them. He knew what it means to carry other people's longings day after day, street after street, while holding your own quietly inside. He knew the hope in a mailbox and the heartbreak of an empty one. He had lived that world more intimately than anyone else in that studio ever could. He wrote the lyrics to please Mister Postman, not as a songwriter performing a craft, but as a man telling the truth about his own life. And that truth, that simple, lived-in honesty, became the heartbeat of what would soon be the most important song in Motown history. The evidence is clear. Every detail of that song traces back to one man's daily experience. But what happened next is where the story breaks. In 1961, Please Mr. Postman was released, and it did not just chart. It climbed. Week after week, it rose through the ranks until it reached the very top of the Billboard pop chart. Number 1. The first number 1 hit in Motown history, the song that proved to the entire industry that Berry Gordy's experiment was not just viable. It was unstoppable. Think about what that means. Every Motown hit that came after, every Supremes record, every Temptations classic, every Marvin Gaye masterpiece, all of it was made possible in part because one song opened the door first. And that song carried the fingerprints of a mail carrier from Detroit who wrote its lyrics from lived experience. But when the credits were printed, when the industry celebrated, when the history books were written, Freddie Gorman's name was not where it should have been. Contracts in those early Motown days were loose. Credit assignments were inconsistent. The company was moving fast, faster than anyone had anticipated, and in that rush, the people without leverage were the easiest to leave behind. Freddie had no contract protecting his contribution. He had no manager fighting for his name. He had trust. And trust, in the music industry, has never been enough. Eddie Holland, Brian's brother, stepped fully into the role of lyricist within the growing songwriting machine. And just like that, Freddie was quietly pushed aside. No meeting, no explanation, no formal goodbye. One day, he was contributing to what would become the most important song the label had ever released. The next day, he was back on his mail route, walking the same streets, delivering the same letters, while the song he helped create played on every radio in America. Let that sit with you for a moment. Just let it land. The song is playing on every radio station in America. The whole country is singing along. Teenagers are dancing to it at house parties. Disc jockeys are calling it the future of popular music. And the man who helped write it, the man whose daily life gave the song its soul, is walking a mail route through the same Detroit streets where the melody first formed in his mind. He is carrying letters, other people's letters, while his own story goes undelivered. This is not the kind of injustice that arrives with villains and dramatic confrontations. This is the quiet kind, the kind that happens when systems move too fast to notice the people they leave behind. The kind that happens when someone is too humble to demand what they deserve. The kind that, once it settles, becomes almost impossible to undo. Because once the credits are printed and the awards are given and the story is told without your name, how do you prove you were ever there at all? Freddie did not shout. He did not file lawsuits. He did not go to the press. He went back to work. He carried the disappointment the same way he carried everything else in his life. Quietly, with dignity, and with a belief that the music would eventually speak for itself. But the music industry does not work that way. The music speaks. But it speaks the names it is told to speak, and Freddie's name had been removed from the conversation. Most people, facing that kind of erasure, would have walked away from music entirely, and no one would have blamed Freddie Gorman if he had. But here's what you need to understand about this man. The same stubbornness that kept him humming melodies on his mail route, the same quiet fire that made him show up at Motown without a contract just because he loved the work. That fire didn't go out. It was still burning. And it was about to lead him somewhere no one expected. By 1964, most of Detroit had moved on. Motown was growing into something massive. New names were rising every month, and Freddie Gorman, the man who had helped light the very first spark, was delivering mail in a city that had already forgotten his contribution. But something about Freddie refused to stay down. A new opportunity came from a place no one expected: Golden World Records, a competing label with hunger in its veins and a sound that was not afraid to challenge Motown's dominance. Freddie connected with songwriter and producer Bob Hamilton, and together they crafted a song called Just Like Romeo and Juliet. It was romantic. It was sincere. And when it was released as a single for the Reflections, it climbed the charts. Not a #1, but a genuine hit. Proof, undeniable proof that Freddie Gorman's talent had not faded just because Motown stopped paying attention. That same year, Freddie released 2 solo singles under Golden World's sister label Rick Tick, In a Bad Way and Take Me Back. Neither became a national sensation, but they carried something that the music industry often overlooks in its chase for hits. They carried honesty, heartbreak, regret, the quiet resilience of a man who refused to surrender his voice even when the world gave him every reason to. Those songs were diary entries set to music, and for the listeners who found them, they were unforgettable. Then came a twist that only the music business could produce. Berry Gordy acquired Golden World's assets, studios, contracts, artists, all of it folded into the Motown machine. And just like that, Freddie Gorman found himself back inside the empire he had helped build years earlier. But this time, the terms were different. He did not return as a ghostwriter searching for scraps of recognition. He returned as a vocalist, a performer, someone who would finally step into the light with his own voice leading the way. Motown placed him in a newly formed group called the Originals: 4 voices, C.P. Spencer, Hank Dixon, Walter Gaines, and Freddie, bringing his deep, grounded bass to a quartet that was built not on flash or choreography or matching suits, but on feeling. Pure feeling. They were not designed to be the loudest act on the roster. They were not designed to compete with the Temptations for dance moves or the Supremes for glamour. They were designed to be the most honest voices in the room. And for a while, that honesty searched for its audience. They recorded. They rehearsed. They performed for crowds that were polite but not yet convinced. The breakthrough stayed just beyond their reach, close enough to see but not close enough to touch. Then Marvin Gaye listened. Marvin, by this point, was not just a singer. He was becoming something closer to a philosopher of sound. He understood emotion the way architects understand space. And when he heard the Originals, he heard something that most people had missed. He heard potential. Not for pop perfection. Not for dance floor domination. He heard potential for truth. Marvin brought the group into the studio. He sat with them through arrangements, sometimes for hours, adjusting a single harmony until it felt right in his chest. He coached their delivery with the patience of someone who knew exactly what kind of feeling he wanted the listener to carry home after the needle lifted from the record. He was not just producing them. He was unlocking something they already had inside, but had never been given permission to fully express. He heard in Freddie's bass a lifetime of waiting, and he knew how to turn that waiting into music that other people could feel in their own lives. The result was Baby, I'm For Real, a song Marvin wrote with his wife Anna Gordy Gaye, and it was everything the originals were meant to be: simple, soulful, painfully honest, the kind of song that sounds like a late-night confession between two people who have decided that the truth matters more than comfort. Freddie's bass wrapped around the melody like a steadying hand. His voice carried the weight of years spent being overlooked, years spent delivering other people's messages while his own went unheard. When Baby I'm For Real was released, something happened that numbers alone cannot explain. It reached number 1 on the R&B chart, number 14 on the pop chart. But more than that, it reached people. Listeners did not just hear the song, they felt it in the place where loneliness and hope sit next to each other. The momentum continued. The Bells, another Marvin Gaye production, hit the top 5 on the R&B chart and came close to cracking the pop top 10 in 1970. For a brief and beautiful window, the original stood shoulder to shoulder with Motown's most celebrated acts. And Freddie Gorman, the mail carrier, the uncredited writer, the man who had been quietly pushed aside more times than anyone should have to endure, was finally standing under a spotlight that matched the depth of everything he had lived. He looked the same, still soft-spoken, still humble, still carrying the quiet dignity he had learned on the streets of Detroit as a boy. The light did not change him. It simply showed the world what had always been there. For the first time in his career, Freddie was not contributing to someone else's moment. He was living his own, and for a while, it felt like the story had finally turned in his favor. But if you have been paying attention, you already know what comes next. Because in this industry, the applause never lasts as long as the silence that follows. Success has a way of making the world believe that an artist is secure. But behind the records and the stage lights, Freddie Gorman's life was entering its most fragile chapter. And this time, the fall came not with a single blow, but with a slow, steady dimming that was almost worse. Motown was changing. The label that had grown from the heartbeat of Detroit was now looking west, preparing its eventual move to Los Angeles. New sounds were rising. Disco was reshaping the dance floor. And the priorities that once defined Motown's soul were being replaced by commercial strategies and a hunger for a different kind of audience. Groups like the Originals, built on harmony, sincerity, and emotional truth, did not fit neatly into that new vision. Their sound was too quiet for a world that was learning to shout. There was one more spark. In 1976, the Originals released Down to Lovetown. It hit number 1 on the disco chart. For a brief moment, it felt like a second resurrection. But even that victory carried an undertone of impermanence. The Originals were never built for the disco world. Their strength was whispering, not shouting. And the industry was no longer interested in whispers. Opportunities slowed. Bookings became smaller. The stages that once held hundreds now held dozens. The audiences grew older and more nostalgic, coming not to discover something new, but to remember something they were afraid of losing. Royalties, never generous to begin with, thinned further under contracts that had always favored the label over the artist. The math was brutal. Hit records did not mean financial security, not for groups like the Originals, not for artists who had signed agreements in a time when asking too many questions meant risking the opportunity entirely. Freddie had been through setbacks before, but he was no longer a young man with endless reserves of energy and an unlimited capacity to start over. He was older now. His body carried the years differently. The weight of decades in an industry that had rarely treated him fairly was becoming harder to carry with each passing season. And then there was the emotional toll, the kind that builds so slowly you almost do not notice until it has settled into your bones. Freddie was a quiet man by nature. He did not complain. He did not give bitter interviews. But those who knew him noticed a heaviness in him during those later years. He had helped write Motown's first number 1 hit. He had stood beside Marvin Gaye and created songs that touched millions. And still, he found himself drifting toward the margins of a story he had helped begin. The applause had faded, the phone had stopped ringing, and the silence that followed felt louder than any standing ovation he had ever received. His health began to decline. The quiet strength that had carried him through every disappointment started to weaken. In time, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. Friends and fellow musicians remembered that even in sickness, Freddie carried himself with the same gentle dignity that had defined him his whole life. There was no anger, No bitterness loud enough for anyone to hear. Just a man who had accepted that life, like music, sometimes ends before the song is finished. On the 13th of June, 2006, Freddie Gorman passed away. He was 67 years old. There were no major headlines. There were no industry ceremonies. There was no Motown retrospective built around his name. His death, like so much of his career, arrived quietly and left the same way. But for those who knew his journey, the silence that followed carried a weight that words have trouble holding. It was the kind of silence reserved for people who gave the world far more than the world ever thought to give back. And yet, that is not where this story ends, because the thing about silence is eventually someone decides to break it. Somewhere right now, at this very moment, Please, Mister Postman is playing. On a streaming playlist someone made for a long drive, in a vintage record shop where a teenager just picked up a Motown compilation for the first time. On a radio station that still believes in the power of songs that make you feel something you cannot quite name. Every time that song plays, Freddie Gorman's fingerprints are on it. Whether his name appears on the credits or not, whether the industry acknowledged him or not, whether the world remembers or not, his truth is woven into every note. So here's the verdict. After everything we have traced today, after the street corners and the mail routes and the makeshift studios and the loose contracts and the silence that lasted decades, the evidence is overwhelming. Freddie Gorman was not a footnote in Motown's story. He was foundation. He was the ground the building stood on. And it is long past time the world said his name out loud. If you agree, I have a small request. Leave a comment, just 2 words, Freddie Gorman, that is all. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone who was never given credit is simply to say their name, to refuse to let the silence win. And if this story meant something to you, if it made you think about the people behind the songs you love, the ones who built the music but never got to stand in the spotlight, the ones who gave everything and asked for nothing except to be remembered, then consider subscribing. Not for me, for stories like this one. Because the people who built the foundation deserve to be named. And the next generation, the kids who will one day discover this music for the first time, they deserve to know where it truly began and whose hands shaped it. Some songs arrive loudly and fade fast. Others arrive quietly and never leave. Freddie Gorman lived the same way. And now that you know his name, his music will never sound the same to you again.